All right. This time we want to talk about Japan, early Japan, the formation of Japan, and how it becomes unified. When we start in our period here, we're going to see that Japan is being ruled by a shogunate, the Ashikaga shogunate. This shogunate, and by the way, a shogunate is the ruler of a general. It's a military-style government. Here you see the ruler. They rule it in a sort of military fashion. It declined by the end of the 15th century, and where the shoguns are the generals. After it declines, Japan will have some upheaval, and will have a warring period, a period where feudal lords are fighting one another, because Japan is being ruled by feudalism, by feudal lords, and the shogun is keeping things in line. Once the shogun is weak, then these other lords begin to fight one another to see which one could come to predominance. Well, we're going to see then eventually the rise of the generals instead of emperors as rulers, and this will be the shogunate. They ruled, their government was sometimes called bakufu. This is a tent government, much like, say, generals before going into battle would gather their tents together. They would have meetings, plan strategies. That's sort of the way they saw the government of running Japan. Now, shogunates then are quite popular in ruling Japan. And you can see that the shogunates then last for over 600 years, right? Almost 700 years. Japan is ruled by military rulers, generals, shoguns. By the way, after World War II, the United States picked up on this idea. And so who did they send to run post-war Japan? They sent a general. They sent in MacArthur, and MacArthur became in essence, the shogun, the general ruling Japan, and that's certainly, I think, the way that people saw him in Japan, as a military ruler, much in the form of a shogun. Well, how does Japan then gain its unity? How do they become unified? You know, if you look back to this map, this is a modern picture, a modern map. You can see the proximity to China, Russia, North and South Korea. This is why, for example, the Japanese are very interested in what North Korea is doing when they start firing off missiles and so forth. You see Japan is not very far away. But also notice how spread out Japan is. It's very long, elongated here. In fact, if you placed it along the United States, the upper islands here would be all the way up to Maine, and the lower islands would be all the way down to Florida. That's how long these are. And since there are multiple islands and they're stretched out in a long ways, it's going to be hard to keep Japan, or to get Japan unified. Now, as it goes, there are three main rulers who unify Japan. I'll put their names here with their dates. We're going to come back and talk about each one in turn. So don't worry, you're going to see their names and dates again. But the first one is Oda Nobunaga. The second is Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And the third one is Tokugawa Ieyasu. So notice it's starting in 1568, ending in 1616. But these three powerful rulers are then credited with unifying Japan. So let's take a look at the first one, Oda Nobunaga. He was the son of a samurai, and you know the samurai were warriors. The samurai, much like a knight in Europe, a feudal warrior who fought with honor, had a very strict code that they follow, and fought with swords primarily. also other hand weapons like that. They are a warrior class governed by strict rules, and we're going to see that Oda, I think, takes some of that idea of discipline, military, and rules that are there. He will start to unify Japan. He is eventually killed by a general, which will bring the end to his reign. But he sets the stage then for the next ruler, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, to become a ruler who will advance further this. Now, he actually came from a farmer's. He was a farmer's son, which is very humble beginnings. He rose up through the military ranks by his prowess, and he is renamed Toyotomi. That's not what his mother named him originally, but Toyotomi is kind of a title or a renaming, and it comes from power, abundant power. So, the cars named Toyotas, they're supposed, their name means power, literally. He will set up a new capital. If you want to sort of unify people, shake things up, one of the things that you can do is to create a new capital. Imagine what would happen if someone came into power in the United States and they moved the capital from Washington, D.C. to somewhere, I've always thought it should be, perhaps is in the center of the United States. Maybe Nebraska, Kansas, someplace like that. It would be defendable. You could argue it's more defendable from anyone who might attack it from the ocean or attack it from the shore. You'd have to go all the way across the United States to get to it. And, of course, that might be your rationale. You say it's for defensive purposes. It puts things in the center and more efficient and so forth. But, of course, one of the real things you're doing, is that you're breaking down the old ties. All those connections in Washington, D.C., the politicians, the lobbyists, all that sort of stuff, they'd all have to move to Nebraska or something, which they're not going to like. And it would shuffle everything up again. So, I wouldn't say don't get rid of Washington, D.C. D.C. will still remain the District of Columbia. It'll have museums and all that sort of thing, monuments. But the functioning government would move somewhere else. So this is what he does. And this is going to shake things up. He moves it to Osaka. Now, the other thing that he will do is he will begin to build castles and extend his power. Actually, it appears that the idea for fortified castles came to Japan via Europe. They hear about it from Europe and how effective they were, and so they begin to build these castles that's somewhat imitating the European model. By 1590, Toyotomi has control of most of Japan, so he's able to advance this unification quite far. Now, he advances it so far that he begins to look for other territories in which he may, in fact, have influence and control and trade. So Japan will actually invade Korea in 1592. This is somewhat controversial, I guess, and going to draw the attention of the Chinese, because the Chinese had always come from their base to the north, like in this green area, and they had come down into the north, and they had a lot of control over the Korean peninsula. The Japanese are going to come in on the south part of the peninsula and invade it in 1592. The dynasty that's there is called the Yi dynasty. It's Korean dynasty, but it is it's loyal to China, because part of what the Japanese wanted to do is get the Yi dynasty to help them attack the Chinese. So the Japanese will come in from the south. They'll eventually take control of Seoul, which is the current capital of South Korea. But part of the problem they have in maintaining control is, there's a lot of guerrilla fighting. There's a lot of sporadic fighting and uprisings against them. And when Toyotomi dies in 1598, the Japanese decide to withdraw. So just after, 6, 7 years, they are withdrawn out of Korea. But this is their foray into it. This is going to bring them to the attention, I suppose, of the Chinese. Now remember, the Chinese are using a feudal system. I'm not sure if we've talked about the feudal system before, but the feudal system is a system whereby land, the control of land, is used in exchange for loyalty and service. So technically, the king, the general, the shogun, controls all the land, but divides it up between the daimyo, or the nobility, the lords, we would call it in Europe, and divides up the control of big chunks of the land to them. But they have to take an oath of loyalty, and they also have to take promise, an oath, that they would serve the shogun in battle. They would come and fight with him if he needed them. Also in this system, there are knights. We call them in Europe. They're called samurai in Japan. These are people who are trained and dedicated warriors, fighting on horseback, fighting with weapons, much like you see this drawing on the screen. Let's move then to the third. This is Tokugawa, Japan. And notice how long it lasts. This is the shogunate, really gets extended here. 1603 to 1868. And so here we see the Tokugawa shogunate is started by Tokugawa Ieyasu. You see him pictured here. Look at this. Pretty amazing set of clothes. The way his horse is decorated and so forth, outfitted. You get the impression, if you see this guy, he's not a regular soldier. He's not a regular person. He is, in fact, the shogun. He is, in fact, the leader. He's going to move the capital again. This time he'll move the capital to Edo. Edo is the name of, well, its current name, its modern name is Tokyo, and so it's still the capital of Japan. But he moved it there again to sort of shake things up and reorganize things under him. He takes the title of shogun in 1603. So this is officially the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate then in 1603. It's a very long-lasting shogunate. As you can see, it lasts for 265 years. It's a very long time. There's a little saying that's used to explain these first three rulers. Oda pounds the national rice cake. Hideyoshi kneads it. And in the end, Ieyasu sits down and eats it. So it's sort of the idea that the first important ruler is just sort of pounding it up, getting it made, getting it ready. The next one kneads it, and I suppose sticks it in the oven. And then the last one, this guy, can come along and really enjoy it. The unification of Japan is complete. And he sits down and he eats it. Well, here's a map, again, that shows you perhaps a little bit better Japan, its proximity to Korea, its proximity to China, and, of course, this would be Russia later on in the north. Look at these grouping of islands, some very large ones, some very small ones, and how they're stretched out all up and down this area. Now again, as we have mentioned before, we're going to have Western influences coming, and it's no different here in Japan, because the expansion from the West is going to come. The first contact from the West is the Portuguese. You know, the Japanese had been very isolated. They had isolated themselves for many, many years, even from China, even from nearby areas. And so the Portuguese showing up after they were blown off course, you know, they were not really initially welcome. But eventually the Portuguese are able to set up a trade agreement with the Japanese. And, of course, as we said, remember, merchants, then comes missionaries, and then finally, often the military. 3 M's. All right. So let's take a look at the missionaries that do come. At least, let's talk about it a little bit. The first missionary that comes is Francis Xavier. Francis Xavier, you might know him because he was also in North America. But he comes as a Jesuit missionary in 1549. Some Japanese convert to Christianity at this time. Of course, he had worked with the picture, the painting is showing here is his work with Native Americans in North America before he went to China. He begins to learn the language of the Japanese, but it was very difficult for him. It's not really clear. It appears he never really mastered the language, however. And he also used, much like the other Jesuits in China, he used these sort of strange inventions of the West, clocks, eyeglasses, and of course he brings with him tobacco from North America. These are all things they had not had in China, and it got their attention. It got them discussing things with him. So we begin to see then Western influence coming in. The lords, the daimyo, begin to buy European weapons, guns, and some small artillery kind of things to defend themselves, to expand their power, and that sort of thing. Certainly Oda and Hideyoshi used these weapons to help them unify Japan. They were powerful weapons to them. Gunpowder and guns to help unify the islands. They also, as I mentioned before, borrowed the idea of castles from the Europeans, and you see their sort of version of a castle here. One of the things that's interesting to take a look at is the growth of Christianity in Japan. And it grows pretty rapidly, actually, some high numbers. But many people think that part of the reason that it grows is because there weren't any good translations of the Bible and of what the Christians were teaching. And so since there was kind of a language barrier, the Japanese could sort of make these things say what they wanted them to say, and there was no good way to correct it, no good way to know exactly what they were thinking about things. At any rate, Xavier didn't learn the languages easily, and certainly Japanese proved to be a difficult one for him. And by the late 16th century, there were thousands of Japanese that had converted to Christianity. Of course, Roman Catholicism. The daimyo decide, I think, in a sense, to sort of contain the Christian influence. They gave the Jesuits Nagasaki as their base of operation. Yes, this is the same place that in the 20th century was bombed with an atomic bomb, Nagasaki, and it has a famous harbor there. And that's what this drawing is. It's a drawing of the harbor at Nagasaki. Many Japanese, they've always been fearful of outsiders, and one thing they were especially worried about with Japanese converting, say, to Roman Catholicism is they knew there was some kind of leader of the Roman Catholics who was an outsider, who was a European, who lived in Italy. They weren't quite sure where that was, but they didn't like this idea that some outsider could be ordering around Japanese people and sort of telling them what to do. They thought this was, they were fearful of this kind of arrangement. So eventually Christian persecution will come in 1587. Christian activity was banned in 1587. Part of what it came over was a controversy over the destruction of shrines in Japan, and that was blamed upon the Christians and the Christian missionaries and that sort of thing. It's not clear that they did this. Someone else may have done it to blame it on them. But at any rate, this got them in trouble, Also, the idea that the Christians would appeal to the lower classes, and it was thought that the lower classes might rebel, that sort of thing. And so this is what, in part, brought the persecution. Now, Toyotomi allowed trade with the Europeans, but he wanted to get rid of these missionaries. He thought that they were a problem. He wanted to force them out. And so eventually he will. Not before there are several Christians who are killed. Some of the missionaries appeal and said, look, let us stay. He said, well, okay, you can stay, but his decree remains. You cannot be evangelizing Christians. You can't be sort of openly working with Christians. So it must be very discreet. It must be low-key, under-the-table kind of activity. But eventually the Spanish Franciscans didn't really want to follow the rules of discretion, it appears. This angered him, and so this led then to 9 missionaries and several of their converts being killed. Here is a monument in Nagasaki commemorating the 26 martyrs from 1597, Christian martyrs. And by 1612, all Christian missionaries were removed, forced to leave Japan. And they also really wanted to limit Western influence, Western control, which they will do. Well, just because the missionaries are gone doesn't mean there weren't Christians there. The Christians were still there, but persecution increased on the Christians. Eventually, they will rebel against this kind of persecution, and they are crushed in 1637, many of them killed and so forth. And then he took a very harsh line. They said, look, we're not going to have any Western trade anymore. We're not going to allow Western trade, especially not these Portuguese and others who brought these missionaries. But they finally worked out a deal. The Portuguese and the Spanish were out. But they said the Dutch could come to one small island in Nagasaki Harbor. And so the Dutch would sail to that island. Their goods would be offloaded on that island. The goods that they wanted to receive would have been loaded onto the island, then onto their ship. And then the goods from their ship would eventually be taken from that island and brought in for trade. So this is some of the conflicts, some of the ideas that we have from Japan. We'll leave it there for now.